This week is the final video in the short row series for March. Today I'm going to show you 3 different variations on the short row sock heel that allow you to use German short rows. As always, if you would like to jump directly to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description, along with links to all the previous short row videos we've done this month. So the standard method of working a sock heel is to divide the stitches in half. So the instep stitches are held on waste yarn, or in this case it's held on the cable of the needle, and the other half of the stitches are used for the heel. So for a short row sock heel, you then divide these stitches into thirds as equally as you can, so that this side over here outside the marker and this side out over here are equal. They have to have equal numbers, and then the center part needs to be within a stitch or so of the outer ones. The process of working a wrap and turn heel is to work across all of the heel stitches until you get to the last stitch, and then you will wrap that last stitch. You'll purl across, and then you'll wrap this last stitch. Then you will work back and forth in one stitch shorter than the previous row each time until all of these stitches have been wrapped outside of the markers. The stitch just inside the marker is the last turning stitch, and for a wrap and turn short row, that means this is where you're going to turn, but this last stitch will be worked. So when you have finished all your wrap and turns and you've come up to the middle portion, you'll see that the last wrap is right outside this gray zone. And that correlates to where the stitch markers are. I have them on the fabric because it drives me crazy to have them on the needles. So you can see that's where the last turn was, just inside the markers. So now we're going to work across all of the heel stitches, and then we're going to work the first stitch after the marker. When you begin working in longer and longer short rows, the first row of the second half of the heel is always worked past the last turning point of the first half of the heel. So this is where we turned, this is where the wrap was, so we have to work past that to the next stitch. So I work the wrap together with the stitch. That's the way I do it. And now we have to turn again. So that means we have to wrap this stitch, and this stitch was already wrapped from the first half of the heel. You can see how we have the shape of the first half of the hourglass. You can see where we're going to be. We've worked past this. We picked this wrap up and we worked it, and now we have to wrap this stitch. And you see how on the chart these are both red. These are stacked turning points. You can only work stacked turning points with a wrap and turn short row like this, or with a yarn over short row. You can't stack German short rows on top of each other. So the first type of heel that can be worked using German short rows looks very similar. The chart, if you look at the chart, it looks very similar to the wrap and turn short row. The difference is that there are 2 rounds of stockinette that are going to be worked at the midpoint. That's one difference. Another difference is that we will be able to work across all of the stitches of the heel and then turn and make our double stitch, the German short row double stitch. Then we can purl across all of the stitches, turn, and then create our double stitch. So we don't have to stop one stitch short because the technique is worked in the turning stitch, not in the stitch across from the turning stitch. So here I have the same setup. I've got 28 stitches. I've got 9 stitches, 10 stitches, 9 stitches, and I'm coming to the last stitch of the heel, the last heel stitch. I'm going to work it, and then I'm going to turn, and I'm going to create the double stitch. And the double stitch is always created, the yarn is in front of the work regardless of what kind of stitch you have just worked or will work. The yarn starts in front. You insert a zip to purl, slip that stitch, and then you pull the yarn over the top to create the double stitch. Now normally, for a normal short row situation, you would just pull it enough to create the two legs. When you're working short row sock heels and you are working each turn next to the previous turn, you want to work these pretty tightly. So after you've pulled and created your double stitch, then you need to position the yarn wherever it needs to be in order to work the next stitch. So I'm going to be purling, so I'm going to move the yarn to the front, and then I'm going to purl all the way across, and then create a double stitch at the other end. So here I am at the last stitch of the heel on the purl side. I'm going to work the stitch. I'm going to turn. Just like before, in order to create the double stitch, the yarn has to be in front. You slip the stitch, pull the yarn over the top to create the double stitch, and you are going to want to work firmly. So you're going to pull it over firmly. And then the yarn needs to be positioned wherever it has to be in order to work the next stitch. I'm going to be working a knit stitch so it stays in the back. Now I'm going to repeat this. I'm going to see the double stitch right here. I'm going to keep working one stitch shorter than I worked before, turn and create a double stitch. And my last turning point is going to be just in the same place it was for the wrap and turn short rows. The last turning stitch will be just inside the markers. So you'll have a double stitch inside the markers. With the wrap and turn, the wrap was outside the marker because the wrap is across from the turning stitch. So here we have all of the double stitches to the right of this marker, and we have double stitches all to the left, plus we have the double stitch just inside, and I'm about to create the final turn double stitch. So this double stitch correlates on the chart to this double stitch here. The two inside the markers are right here, and at this point I'm about to work 2 complete rounds of stockinette. So I'm going to be working across all of the heel stitches, across all of the double stitches, and then I will work across the instep, across the double stitches here, and then I will do one more round. So I'm coming to the double stitches. I'm now going to work each double stitch. So I've worked across the double stitches on this side of the heel, and now I'm going to work across the instep stitches. Now if this sock were knit in a stitch pattern, I would be working the next row of whatever stitch pattern would be called for. And now I work across the double stitches on the right side of the heel all the way back to the marker. And when you work short rows in the round, these stitches would normally have been worked on a purl side, but I'm working them on the round, so I'm working them from the knit side. And they do tend to look slightly different, even though technically they should be exactly the same. It doesn't matter what technique you're using. Short rows worked in the round tend to look slightly different. And for me, these are a little bit gappy. So we have completed the first round, and now we have to do a second round, and we come back to this marker. Okay, so now I've worked the second round. So I worked the first half of the heel, I've worked 2 full rounds of stockinette, and now I can begin the second half of the heel. So if we look at the chart, we can see these were those final turning points that were inside the markers. So when we resume getting our longer short rows, our first turn is going to be outside of the markers, and that's going to line up with the same, it's going to stack these two short rows on top of each other, which we can do now because we have a couple of rows of stockinette between them. These final turns are never stacked. So now I'm going to work the stitch after the marker. I turn and I can go ahead and create a double stitch. I work across all of those center heel stitches. So that was the 10th stitch, and now I'm going to work that first one that's past the marker. I turn. I create my double stitch. Now I'm going to work back across until I come to the double stitch. I work the double stitch. Then I work the stitch after it. I turn and I create the new double stitch. So you continue in this manner, working across until you get to the double stitch, then work one stitch past the double stitch to create the new double stitch. So this is going to continue until I have worked all the way across and I work a double stitch in the last stitch on a knit row, turn, purl across, create a double stitch on the last purl stitch of the heel. So I finished the heel. I have, I'm about to turn here and create the last double stitch, and then I'll resume working in the round. So I'll make a double stitch, work all the way across, work that double stitch, then I can again begin working the instep, and when I come back to the back side to the sole stitches, then I'll work that double stitch together. I mentioned before, you really need to work your short rows tightly, and I don't think I worked the first half tightly enough on this side. You can see on this side. This is also thicker yarn, so it looks a little gappy here. I do have a sock heel that I worked on using sock yarn at a gauge of 9 stitches an inch. So you can, I did nothing to. This is the cast, so this is the bind off. So I worked it this way, and then this way. I did nothing to close holes at the corners, so you can see that this method does a pretty good job at the corners. You don't get the holes that you can get. The disadvantage to this particular heel is that if you're working the heel in a contrast color, and then when you work the 2 rounds at the midpoint, you're going to have two rounds of color across your instep, which you wouldn't want. And for some self-striping yarns, that might be a problem. But for solid color sock yarns, that way, if you're working a stitch pattern, it can work very well. In the second sock heel version, the steps are very similar with a couple of differences. The first difference is that you are going to work across the first row and stop with 1 stitch left at the end. So if you look at this, stitch 28 is left blank because we're not working there right now. So you work up to stitch 27, turn, and then create your double stitch. So at each end you leave 1 stitch unworked. Right now I've got 3 stitches left, so I'm going to work 2 of them. I'm going to leave that last stitch unworked, turn, work my double stitch, my firm double stitch, purl back to the other end, and leave 1 stitch unworked at that end as well. From there, we'll continue to work as with the first version, working 1 stitch less each row and ending with that final turn inside of the markers. So at this point, I have done all my double stitches for the first half of the sock heel. You can see that I have left the far stitch on the right as plain as is the end stitch on the left. So now we begin the midpoint of the sock heel. If we look at the chart, this is where I am right now. So I've done the final turn, and now I'm going to work all the way across to that very last stitch that's plain. I'm going to make a double stitch. I'm going to purl back all the way to the end where I have that single plain stitch, make a double stitch, and then I will return here. And at this point, I can then work the second half of the sock heel. So now I've worked the 2 rows, and you can see that I have worked all the double stitches, so I have plain stitches here except at the very end here and the very end here. So now I am going to work across all of the heel stitches until I get to the stitch just past the marker, and then I will turn and make a double stitch, and then I will begin and I do the same thing on the other side of this marker, and then I'll be working back and forth just as I did in the previous type of heel. Okay, now I'm about to work this last row. I am working this last row here. I'm about to do this final turn, and I want to show you how this is a little bit different. So I'm knitting across until I get to the double stitch. Here's the double stitch. I'm going to knit it like always, and then I knit the next stitch. So this is the last single stitch that I have. This is the double stitch that was created at the midpoint of the heel. So I work that stitch, I turn, and I create a double stitch here. So now I have 2 double stitches at this end, and I'm going to do the same thing at the other end. Okay, so I'm about to work the double stitch, and then I have the last single stitch here. I'm going to turn and create the final double stitch. So now I have 2 double stitches at this end, and I have 2 double stitches at that end. So I'm about to start row 37 because I've just created this double stitch. So at this point I'm going to begin working in rounds again. So I'm going to work all the way across here, and I'm going to be working the double stitch I just created at that end, plus I'm going to be working the double stitch I created at the midpoint, and those are the 2 double stitches there. So I'll work across the instep, and then when I finally come around, then I'll be able to work those 2 double stitches, and then I'm finished with the heel. So I just wanted to show what this looked like. Let's get in really close so you can see. I think this is nicer looking result than working in the round, because you can work the double stitches on this side on the purl side when you're working back and forth. And for me, I get a nicer result. So you can see, and I didn't do anything to fix holes at the corners. So this is the view from the left side of the heel, and this is a view from the right side of the heel. We are going to start out exactly the same way that we started for the first heel. So we're going to work all the way across the stitches, turn, create a double stitch, work all the way across the stitches, turn, create a double stitch. Keep doing that just as for the first heel variation until we have worked the turning stitches, the final turning stitches inside the markers. For the second half of the heel, you'll see that the symbols are different. When we were using these, this meant we worked to the end of the row, we turned, created a double stitch, worked to the end of the row, turned, created a double stitch, etc. So we're creating our last double stitch here just inside the marker. We're going to knit all the way across, and this time we're going to turn and we're just going to slip the stitch. We're not going to create a new double stitch. You can't create a double stitch, work it, and then turn and create another double stitch. They just don't vertically stack. So, which is why we did stockinette, rounds and rows in the other 2 versions. But it does work pretty well to just turn and slip that stitch. So you can see here I've got double stitches all the way across that side. Here are my center stitches. You can see I haven't created this double stitch yet. There's the last double stitch just inside the marker, and I've got a double stitch just inside this marker. So I'm going to knit across all of the heel stitches, so I'll get rid of this double stitch, and then I'm going to come to the stitch outside the marker, knit that double stitch, and turn and slip. So I'm going to, at the beginning, at this transition from the end of the first half of the heel to the beginning of the second half of the heel, I'll be knitting 2 double stitches in a row, turning, and then slip. So I created my final double stitch. Now I'm going to knit across. I knit the double stitch inside the marker. Then I knit the double stitch outside the marker. I'm going to split that. Now I turn, and I'm going to be working firmly. So I'm going to slip the stitch and keep it firm, and then I'm going to purl across. I'm going to purl this double stitch inside the marker and the double stitch outside the marker. Now I'm going to turn, and I'm just going to slip it. I'm not creating a double stitch. From now on, we will work a double stitch. And I'm snugging it up, turn, and I will just slip. And you continue until you have worked all of the double stitches, or you have worked all except the last double stitches. So at this point I have worked all of the double stitches except for the ones at each end. Now what I have done in the past is to continue and work the double stitch, turn, slip, purl back, and work this double stitch, turn and slip, and then resume working in the round. But I often have to then work some kind of technique at these corners to prevent holes. What you can do at this point, resume working in the round. Okay, so I have worked all the way around, so I've worked both corners, and it might be a little tricky to see here, but I think you can see that the join is pretty nice at that corner. I did work those end stitches and turn and slip them, but I also worked a technique at the corner to close the holes a little bit. I worked at 9 stitches per inch, so you can see that heel line there looks pretty good, and I'll show you the other side here as well. So you can see that distinctive diagonal line, but it looks really great. So this is my preferred method, this final version, but any of the methods will work depending on what you like best. If you have any comments or have some follow-up questions, you can join the discussion in my group on Ravelry. Links down in the description. Thanks for watching.